before I tell you what happened to the men who surrendered, I need you to understand something about the moment the guns went quiet. I was 19 years old in May of 1945. I had been in uniform since I was 17, and I had seen enough by that point to last 10 lifetimes. I had seen men die in ways that I still cannot describe without my hands shaking. I had seen cities reduced to rubble, so complete that you could not tell where the streets had been. I had smelled the particular smell of a battlefield 2 days after the fighting stopped, and I carry that smell with me to this day in the back of my memory, in the part that does not sleep. So when May 8th came, when the German High Command signed the instrument of unconditional surrender and the shooting stopped across the whole Europe, what I felt was not triumph. What I felt was something closer to the emptiness that comes after a very long illness finally breaks. An exhausted, hollow relief. Church bells rang. Men cried. Somebody opened a bottle somewhere and passed it around, and I drank from it without tasting anything. We had won. After 6 years and 60 million dead, we had won. What I did not understand on that day, what almost nobody was permitted to understand on that day, was that for millions of German soldiers standing in the mud of a defeated Reich, the war had not ended. It had only changed its shape. The shooting had stopped. The dying had not. This is the story of what happened to approximately 11 million German prisoners of war in the months and years after the Second World War ended. It is a story of deliberate legal maneuvering, of improvised cruelty, of institutional cowardice, of hunger used as a weapon in a season of supposed peace. It is a story that was classified and suppressed for 40 years. It is a story that deserves to be told in full, without mythology on either side, because the truth of it, the actual documented, archivally verifiable truth, is complicated enough and dark enough to speak for itself without any embellishment. If you have spent any time with this channel, you know that I do not traffic in comfortable myths. I deal in what actually happened, documented to the best of our ability to document it, told with the complexity it deserves. And what actually happened to the German prisoners of the Second World War is one of the most contested, most obscured, and most humanly significant chapters of the entire conflict. So stay with me. This is going to take some time. The scale of what we are dealing with demands a moment of stillness before we can go any further. When I say 11 million prisoners, I want you to feel the weight of that number rather than simply processing it as a statistic. 11 million men is roughly the entire current active duty military force of every NATO member nation combined. It is a number so large that simply providing those men with 1 meal per day would require a logistical operation equivalent to supplying a full-scale offensive campaign. It is a number that would strain the administrative capacity of any organization on Earth, let alone an army that was simultaneously advancing on Berlin, managing the liberation of concentration camps across Germany and Poland, processing millions of displaced civilians, and trying to function as an occupying power in a country whose entire governmental structure had just collapsed. The prisoners arrived all at once. That is the crucial thing to understand about the spring of 1945 in Europe. The German military did not surrender gradually, in organized batches that could be processed and housed and fed in an orderly sequence. It collapsed. Entire armies surrendered in a single afternoon. Divisions put their hands up by the tens of thousands. Men emerged from forests and bombed-out basements and cellars in numbers that overwhelmed every plan the Allied armies had made for handling prisoners of war. The Americans had built prisoner cages at various points along their line of advance through France and Belgium and the Rhineland. They were designed to handle the kind of prisoner flow that previous experience suggested was reasonable. Hundreds at a time, perhaps a few thousand in a particularly active sector after a major engagement. What they got instead, in the final weeks of April and the first weeks of May 1945, was a tidal wave. Men surrendering so fast that there was no time to process them, no time to count them accurately, no time to establish adequate facilities before the next wave arrived. The Rhine River became the organizing geography of the crisis. The American Army, which had crossed the Rhine in force in March, designated large open fields along both banks as temporary holding areas for the flood of surrendering Germans. These areas were enclosed in barbed wire, quickly and not always very thoroughly, and given an official designation. They were called Rhine Meadow Camps. And into those Rhine Meadow Camps, In the spring and early summer of 1945, the Americans herded somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million German prisoners. The word camp implies a structure, an organization, a set of facilities designed for human habitation. The Rhine Meadow Camps had none of those things, because there had been no time to build them and no inventory of materials to build them with. There were no barracks. There were no latrines. There were no kitchens. In many of the camps, there was no shelter whatsoever. Nothing between the men and the sky above them except whatever they had carried on their own backs. The first weeks of May in the Rhineland were cold and wet. Rain fell on men who had no cover. Temperatures at night dropped to levels that were dangerous for men who were already weakened by years of inadequate military rations at the end of a losing war. And the food distribution, when it happened at all, was entirely inadequate for the numbers present. I want to be fair about what caused this. The chaos of the Rhine Meadow Camps was not, in its origins, the product of malice. The American army was genuinely overwhelmed. The logistical challenge of feeding and housing 2 million people who arrived over the course of a few weeks in a country whose agricultural and transportation infrastructure had been systematically destroyed by years of Allied bombing was genuinely beyond any organization's capacity to handle cleanly. Things fell apart at the edges because the center was holding by willpower alone, and because nobody had planned for a collapse this fast or this total. But here is where the story becomes more troubling, because the chaos of the Rhine Meadow Camps was not only a product of being overwhelmed, it was also, in part, a product of a deliberate policy decision that stripped those prisoners of the legal protections that should have governed their treatment. And that decision did not happen by accident. It was made by men in positions of authority who understood exactly what they were doing. In late April of 1945, as the German surrender became imminent and the scale of the prisoner problem became impossible to ignore, the American military command made a decision that has never received the historical attention it deserves. They reclassified the German prisoners, not all of them, but the vast majority of those in the Western Theater, from prisoners of war to a new category that American military lawyers invented specifically for the occasion. They called this new category disarmed enemy forces. DEFs. On paper, this solved an administrative problem. The Geneva Conventions of 1929, which the United States had signed and which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, required that POWs be fed at a standard equivalent to the capturing army's own rear echelon troops. With potentially 11 million German prisoners in the Western Theater alone, maintaining that standard was a mathematical impossibility. By reclassifying the Germans as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, the army freed itself from the legal obligation to meet the Geneva standard. What this reclassification also did, and this was not incidental, it was a whole point, was remove the mechanisms that the international community had established to ensure compliance with the laws of war. The International Committee of the Red Cross had a legal right, under the Geneva Conventions, to inspect prisoner of war camps and intervene when conditions fell below the required standard. They had food stocks assembled and were ready to distribute them to camps where rations were inadequate. When they attempted to do so in the American-held DEF camps along the Rhine, they were turned away. Their access was denied. Their supplies were refused. The legal fiction of a new category had created a space in which the cameras of the international humanitarian community could not see, and what happened inside that space was nobody's official business. What was happening inside that space was this. Men were subsisting on rations that the most conservative estimates placed at somewhere between 800 and 1,200 calories per day, less than half of the adult male baseline requirement, and a tiny fraction of what a man doing physical labor in cold weather requires to maintain his body. Men with no shelter dug holes in the mud to sleep in, because holes in the ground held body heat better than the open air. They constructed crude lean-tos from whatever debris they could scavenge from inside the wire. They drank from puddles when the water distribution did not reach them. They died of exposure, of dysentery caused by contaminated water, of pneumonia accelerated by malnutrition, of starvation in its later stages. The muscle wasting, the organ failure, the gradual systemic collapse that hunger produces when it goes on long enough. The death toll in the Rhine Meadow Camps is one of the most contested questions in the entire historiography of the Second World War. For 40 years, the official American position was that the death rate was negligible, comparable to normal peacetime mortality rates, essentially nothing significant. This position was maintained through the active classification and suppression of records that documented what had actually happened. When a Canadian author and publisher named James Baquet published a book called Other Losses in 1989, he alleged that General Dwight D. Eisenhower had deliberately engineered the starvation deaths of approximately 1 million German prisoners. The book became an international sensation. It also became, in its most dramatic claims, a serious historical controversy. Mainstream historians, including German historians, who had every reason to want a full story told, examined Baquet's methodology and found it deeply flawed. His numbers were based on misreadings of military records, double-counted deaths, and statistical extrapolations that did not survive scrutiny. The claim of deliberate Eisenhower-ordered mass murder was not supported by the evidence. But, and this is the crucial thing, in the process of dismantling Baquet's most extreme claims, historians confirmed that something real had happened. The Rhine Meadow Camps were real. The DF reclassification was real and documented. The denial of Red Cross access was real and documented. The inadequate rations were real and documented. The deaths, while almost certainly far fewer than 1 million, and not the product of deliberate murder Baquet alleged, were real and documented. What the academic community established in the wake of the Baquet controversy was a more complex and more honest truth. That preventable deaths occurred in American-held camps, that the institutional response was to suppress the evidence, and that the American record in the immediate post-war period was significantly worse than the official story had acknowledged for 4 decades. The best current estimates, based on the work of German military historian Rudiger Overmans and others who have spent years examining the archival record, placed the number of deaths in American-held camps in Germany in the months after the wars ended somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 men. That is not 1 million, but it is also not nothing. And the mechanisms that produce those deaths, the legal reclassification, the denial of oversight, the institutional suppression of evidence, are historically significant regardless of the final body count. The American story is troubling. The French story is worse. And I want to spend time on the French story, because it is a part of this history that tends to be skipped over most quickly, perhaps because France's status as a victim nation makes it uncomfortable to examine France's conduct as a captor. France in 1945 was a country in a condition that the word devastation only partially captures. 6 years of occupation had extracted enormous material and human costs from French society. The German administration had requisitioned French agricultural production, French industrial output, French raw materials, and French labor for years. Something like 600,000 French workers had been taken to Germany as forced labor under the service du travail obligatoire, the compulsory work service that the Vichy government had administered on the occupiers' behalf. French Jews had been deported to death camps with the active cooperation of the French police. The French resistance had fought a guerrilla war against an occupier that responded with massacres of civilian villages. By May 1945, France was economically broken, infrastructurally damaged, and psychologically fractured in ways that no simple surrender ceremony could repair. France also desperately needed labor. Its farms were unworked. Its railways were damaged. Its mines were shuttered. Its bombed cities needed to be cleared and rebuilt. And in the spring of 1945, France had access to a very large supply of men who could be compelled to provide that labor at essentially no cost. The Americans and the British transferred approximately 800,000 German prisoners to French custody in the months after the German surrender. These men were distributed across France to work in agriculture, in mining, in construction and forestry. They cleared rubble from the ports of Cherbourg and Brest that German demolition teams had mined on their retreat. They worked the coal mines of Lorraine, the forests of the Vosges, the vineyards and wheat fields of the French interior. They rebuilt railway lines and bridges and roads. They were, to be precise about the legal terminology, forced laborers. In a country that had just freed itself from a regime that had made forced labor a cornerstone of its war economy, the conditions in French custody were, by any honest accounting, catastrophic. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which had been denied access to the American DF camps but managed to gain access to some French-held facilities, produced reports in 1945 in 1946 that used language typically reserved for the worst wartime atrocities. The reports described prisoners who were skeletal, who could barely stand, who were performing heavy labor on rations the ICRC estimated at between 900 and 1,300 calories per day. The French government's distribution of food to prisoner work details was erratic, sometimes non-existent for days at a stretch. The housing provided to prisoners working in agricultural areas was frequently the same kind of primitive shelter that the Rhine Meadow prisoners had been trying to construct from scraps. Open barns, unheated sheds, whatever was available and cost nothing. Prisoners who became too ill or too weak to work were sometimes simply turned out of farms and construction sites that had been using them, creating roving groups of desperately sick men with no shelter, no food, and no official status. The French military administration's record-keeping was chaotic enough that men could disappear from the prisoner rolls entirely without anyone noticing for weeks. The death rate in French custody in the period from May 1945 through the end of 1946 was dramatically higher than in American custody, credible historical estimates. And here I am relying primarily on the demographic work of Rudiger Overmans and the specific research of historians who have examined the French prisoner records, suggests that somewhere between 15 and 20% of German prisoners held by France in the first year after the war's end died in captivity. If the total number of prisoners transferred to French custody was approximately 800,000, that would imply deaths in the range of 120,000 to 160,000 men. I want to pause here and acknowledge directly what some of you are thinking. The men who died in French custody were soldiers of an army that had occupied France for 4 years. They were soldiers of a regime that had deported French Jews, executed French hostages, worked French forced laborers to death in German factories, and massacred French villages. The rage and grief behind the conditions of their captivity were not abstractions. They were the accumulated weight of 4 years of occupation and 6 years of war, felt in the bodies and minds of every French person who had survived it. I am not asking you to weigh that context against the deaths in the camps and decide which was worse. I am asking you to hold both things simultaneously, because history does not permit us the luxury of considering only the parts that make us comfortable. What I am also asking you to notice is the mechanism. The prisoners died not because French civilians hunted them down or executed them, though there were isolated incidents of that kind of violence in the immediate aftermath of liberation. They died because an official system, administered by the French military and approved at the level of the French government, subjected them to conditions that the French government's own records and the independent observations of the Red Cross documented as incompatible with survival. That is a different moral category from spontaneous retributive violence. That is a policy. The British managed their German prisoners differently, and the contrast is worth examining carefully because it tells us something important about what was actually possible in 1945, and therefore about the choices that produced the outcomes in American and French custody. The British Army had a tradition of adherence to the Geneva Conventions that was, by the standards of the Second World War, genuinely remarkable. Even in the Pacific Theater, fighting against Japanese forces that routinely violated every rule of war with evident relish. The British generally maintained the letter of the convention in their treatment of Japanese prisoners. This was not purely altruistic. The British understood, at an institutional level, that the moral standing of the empire depended in part on being seen to conduct war within the framework of international law, even when the enemy did not. They also understood that prisoners who were treated adequately functioned better as labor, and the British were quite systematic about using prisoner labor for post-war reconstruction in their occupation zone. With German prisoners, the British were meticulous in a way that stands in sharp contrast to both the Americans and the French. Rations were maintained at levels that the Red Cross considered adequate. Red Cross access was not only permitted but facilitated. Death rates in British custody were a small fraction of those in American or French facilities. The prisoners in the British occupation zone of Germany were employed in reconstruction work, clearing rubble, repairing infrastructure, working on farms, but they were fed sufficiently to perform that work, and the official British position was that a prisoner who died of preventable causes in British custody was an administrative failure, not an acceptable operational expense. Why did the British do better? There are several reasons. The British had handled large numbers of Italian prisoners earlier in the war and had developed institutional systems for prisoner management that the Americans, who had entered the war later and encountered the prisoner problem at a smaller scale for most of the conflict, simply did not have. The British also had a clearer chain of command in their occupation zone, which meant that official policy was more reliably implemented at the camp level. And the British, frankly, did not have the same weight of justified rage toward German prisoners that the French did. They had been bombed and they had bled, but they had not been occupied, and the specific fury of a formerly occupied people was not part of the institutional dynamic. The practical lesson is important. The British experience demonstrates that treating German prisoners adequately in 1945 was not impossible. It was a choice. The question of why the Americans and the French made different choices is a question about institutional priorities, legal frameworks, political pressures, and individual moral decisions made at multiple levels of command. Now I need to take you east, because what happened to German prisoners in Soviet hands makes everything I have told you so far look, by comparison, relatively mild. And I do not say that to minimize what happened in the American and French camps. I say it because the scale and the deliberateness and the duration of what the Soviet Union did to its German prisoners represents one of the most significant episodes of mass prisoner death in the history of warfare, and it has been systematically underplayed in Western historical memory for reasons that have more to do with Cold War politics than with the actual weight of the evidence. The Soviet Union captured approximately 3 million German prisoners during the war and in its final weeks. The figure is imprecise because Soviet record-keeping in the chaos of the final offensive was incomplete, and because the question of exactly who counted as a prisoner and who counted as a civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time was not always cleanly resolved. But the core figure, somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million German prisoners entering Soviet captivity, is well established. These men entered a system that was already one of the most extensive forced labor mechanisms in human history. The Gulag, the network of labor camps administered by the Soviet Interior Ministry that had consumed millions of Soviet citizens since the early 1930s, was repurposed to receive German prisoners as what Stalin and the Soviet leadership explicitly regarded as a legitimate form of war reparations. Germany had destroyed enormous portions of the Soviet Union's industrial and agricultural infrastructure during Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent years of occupation. Soviet leadership calculated that German prisoner labor was a reasonable way to begin rebuilding what German aggression had destroyed. This calculation was not irrational from a purely strategic standpoint. What it ignored was the human cost of the system through which that labor would be extracted. The Gulag had never been designed to keep its prisoners alive. It had been designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost, with whatever mortality resulted accepted as an operational variable. Soviet prisoners had died in those camps by the millions throughout the 1930s and 1940s. German prisoners were subjected to the same system and died at comparable rates. The work assignments were brutal. German prisoners worked in coal mines in the Donbass region of Ukraine and in the Vorkuta coal field above the Arctic Circle. They worked in logging operations in the Urals and in western Siberia, felling timber in temperatures that regularly dropped to minus 30 or 40 degrees Celsius. They built factories in the Ural industrial region, dams and hydroelectric plants along the Volga and its tributaries, roads and railways across the vast distances of the Soviet interior. The physical demands were extreme. The food rations were calibrated to the work quota. Men who met their quotas received barely sufficient rations. Men who fell below their quotas received less. Men who could not work at all received almost nothing. This created a spiral from which it was almost impossible to escape. Undernourished men could not meet their quotas. Men who did not meet their quotas were further undernourished. Further undernourishment produced illness, which prevented work, which produced further reduction in rations. The death rate was catastrophic, particularly in the first 2 years. The winter of 1945 to 1946 killed German prisoners in the Siberian camps in numbers that the Soviet records, which were not accessible to Western researchers until after the Soviet Union's collapse, document with an administrative dispassion that is itself a form of horror. Monthly mortality reports from individual camps record death rates of 5, 8, 10% per month. A 10% monthly mortality rate, compounded over a year, means that fewer than 30% of the men who entered a camp at the beginning of that year were still alive at its end. The Soviet Union did not release its last acknowledged German prisoners until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. The men repatriated in that final wave were in many cases men whose names have been reported as killed in action or missing by German military records, men whose families had mourned them as dead for a decade. They returned to a West Germany that had spent 11 years rebuilding itself, to families that had restructured around their absence, to a country that was in many respects unrecognizable to men who had last seen it in 1945. There are credible accounts, and the archival evidence from a partial opening of Soviet records after 1991 supports some of them, of German prisoners who were never officially acknowledged, men who were absorbed into the Soviet labor camp population without ever being formally registered as prisoners of war. These men had no legal existence in the prisoner system, which meant they had no path to repatriation. Some of them may have remained in the Soviet system indefinitely. The full accounting may never be possible. The total death toll of German prisoners in Soviet custody is the subject of ongoing historical debate. The most careful demographic work suggests a figure somewhere between 1 million and 1.3 million men, roughly 1 in 3 of those who entered Soviet captivity, set against the 25 million Soviet dead of the Second World War, set against the deliberate German policy of starving Soviet prisoners to death, more than 3 million of them. This figure exists in a context that shapes how we understand it. Context does not change the count, but it shapes the moral architecture of the question. I want to tell you about a man I will call Werner. I am not using his family name because his descendants are living people who deserve their privacy. Werner was born in 1924 in a small town in Baden-Württemberg, the son of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. He was conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1943 at the age of 18 and served on the Eastern Front for the final 2 years of the war. He was captured by Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia in the first days of May 1945, literally within days of the German surrender. He spent 11 years in Soviet captivity. He worked in a coal mine in Ukraine for the first 3 years. He worked on railway construction in Kazakhstan for 2 years after that. He survived bouts of typhus, dysentery, and what he later described as a kind of starvation so thorough that it changed the way he related to food for the rest of his life. He could never again eat a meal without a physical anxiety that the food might be taken from him before he finished it. He returned to West Germany in 1956 at the age of 31. His mother was alive. His father had died in 1951 without knowing whether his son was living or dead. His hometown had been rebuilt, expanded, made prosperous in the first wave of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of post-war West Germany. Everything he had known was simultaneously familiar and completely altered. He did not talk about what had happened to him for many years. Almost none of the men who returned from Soviet captivity talked about it immediately. There were several reasons for this. Shame was one. The shame of having served a criminal regime, the shame of having been defeated, the shame of the specific indignities of captivity. Fear was another. The Federal Republic of Germany in the 1950s was a country in which the political climate made certain conversations difficult, and a returning soldier talking about his suffering in Soviet camps could easily be accused of using his own victimhood to deflect from Germany's guilt. And simple exhaustion was a third. Men who had survived 11 years of what Werner survived often found that the energy required to speak about it was simply not available. The silence of the survivors was one of the mechanisms by which the full history of the German prisoner experience was suppressed. Another mechanism was institutional. The American military's records of the Rhine Meadow Camps were classified in the late 1940s, and specific documents that recorded ration levels, mortality data, and internal communications about camp conditions were removed from the files made available to researchers. When American historians began examining the post-war prisoner record in the 1970s and 1980s, they found gaps in the archives that were consistent with deliberate removal of sensitive material. The gaps have since been partially filled by documents that were reclassified during the wave of declassifications of the 1980s and 1990s. But the original classification decisions tell their own story about institutional priorities. The French prisoner records were similarly incomplete, though in the French case the incompleteness owed more to the chaotic administration of the prisoner program than to deliberate suppression. The French military simply did not maintain consistent records of prisoner mortality in 1945 and 1946, and the records that do exist were not systematically examined by historians until the late 1990s. The result was that the scale of French prisoner deaths was not well established by historical scholarship until very recently, and is still not widely known outside specialist circles. I want to address directly the question that is probably forming in some of your minds, because it is a legitimate question, and it deserves a direct answer. Why should we care about what happened to German prisoners? Why does their suffering merit historical attention when those same men served a regime responsible for the worst crimes in modern history? The answer is not that their suffering was equivalent to the suffering of the Holocaust victims. It was not. The Holocaust was a deliberate, ideologically motivated, industrially organized campaign to exterminate entire peoples. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered. The Roma people lost perhaps a quarter of their entire European population. The disabled were systematically killed. Soviet prisoners were deliberately starved to death by the millions. The scale of German-caused death and suffering was such that the deaths of German prisoners in post-war captivity represent a small fraction of the total human accounting, a footnote in the ledger of suffering that German policy created. And yet, history is not only a competition of atrocities, in which the worst crime erases all consideration of lesser crimes. History is the attempt to understand what actually happened in all its complexity, so that we can see clearly how human beings behave under extreme conditions, how institutions make moral choices, how legal frameworks can be constructed to permit or prevent suffering, how power is exercised over the powerless, and what happens when the people responsible for those choices decide that accountability is inconvenient. The mechanisms that produced the Rhine Meadow deaths, the legal reclassification that stripped human beings of their protections, the institutional incentives that made it easier to classify men as a subcategory of humanity than to feed them adequately, the bureaucratic machinery through which legitimate rage was channeled into preventable death, the subsequent suppression of the evidence. Those mechanisms are not unique to Germany in 1945. They appear in different contexts, under different flags, in different historical moments. Understanding them clearly in the specific historical instance where the documentary record now permits us to examine them is part of what it means to take history seriously. There is also the question of what the suppression of this history did to the people who lived with it. The Federal Republic of Germany was built on a foundation of historical accountability, the Aufarbetung der Vergangenheit, the working through of the Nazi past, which produced a democratic political culture that has wrestled with German history with a seriousness and a thoroughness that most nations have never matched. That reckoning was real and necessary and produced something genuinely valuable. But running alongside that official reckoning was a private silence about the German experience of the war's end, about the firebombing of German cities, about the expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe in conditions of considerable brutality, about the deaths in the prisoner camps. These experiences were not suppressed because they were comparable to the Holocaust. They were suppressed because any acknowledgement of German suffering was felt to risk contaminating the moral clarity of the official narrative of German guilt. The result was a generation of Germans who processed their grief in private while performing a public accountability that was genuine but also, in certain respects, carried a weight of unspoken things. When historians began to examine these suppressed histories in the late 1980s and 1990s, the reaction from parts of the German political establishment was itself instructive. There was real anxiety that acknowledging German suffering might be exploited by right-wing revisionists who wanted to use it to suggest a moral equivalence that did not exist, or to argue that German crimes were no worse than the crimes committed against Germans. That anxiety was not irrational. Revisionist historians and political actors did in fact attempt to exploit these histories in exactly that way. But the solution to the exploitation of historical truth by bad faith actors is not to suppress the historical truth. It is to tell the truth fully and carefully, with appropriate context and appropriate proportionality, and to trust the public to be capable of holding complexity. There is a dimension of the story that the statistics and the policy documents cannot fully convey, and that is the specific texture of daily life inside the camps. I want to try to give you that texture, because it is where the abstraction of history becomes human, and because the details matter in a way that numbers alone cannot communicate. In the Rhine Meadow Camps at their peak density, in April and May of 1945, the fields along the river held men at a concentration so high that there was no room to lie down without touching a person on either side. Survivors described the experience of trying to sleep in those conditions. The impossibility of finding a position that did not mean resting your weight on the body of another man. The way that personal space, the most basic psychological requirement of human dignity, simply ceased to exist. Men who had fought for years and survived things that should not be survivable found that this particular deprivation, the inability to be alone, to have a boundary between themselves and the men around them, was one of the hardest things to endure. Water was a recurring crisis. The rivers were close, but river water was contaminated by the density of human waste in the fields. Wells within the camps were quickly overwhelmed. Distribution of fresh water was erratic and insufficient. Men who had not had adequate water for 2 or 3 days made calculations about whether to drink from the puddles that formed after rain. Calculations that weighed the certain misery of thirst against the probabilistic misery of dysentery, and that often resolved in favor of the puddles, which then produced the dysentery. The diarrhea caused by contaminated water in men who were already malnourished produced a spiral of dehydration and weakness that could kill within days. The medical situation was, from the beginning, essentially non-existent. The American Army had not staffed the Rhine Meadow fields with medical personnel because the fields had not been planned as long-term holding facilities. When prisoners arrived with wounds that had not been treated during the final chaotic days of the fighting, and many did arrive in this condition, there was no one to treat them. Men died of infected wounds that would have been trivially manageable with basic antibiotics and proper dressing. German army medics who were among the prisoners did what they could with what they had, which was almost nothing. They improvised bandages from torn cloth. They organized the men in their immediate vicinity, with the discipline of soldiers, applying the only professional skills they had left. The psychological dimension of captivity, the disorientation, the helplessness, the sense of having been discarded by history, produced its own casualties. Men who had functioned under extreme stress for years, sustained by the demands of combat and the bonds of unit cohesion, found that the emptiness of captivity was in some ways harder to bear than the fighting had been. The fighting had required constant attention, constant response. Captivity offered nothing but time, and time in those conditions was its own kind of suffering. There were also, in every camp, acts of human solidarity that deserved to be recorded alongside the suffering. Men shared food in circumstances where sharing meant taking from your own inadequate portion. German army chaplains who had been captured conducted services in the open fields, standing in the mud with their congregation packed around them, in extremity. People find what holds them together, and in the Rhine Meadow Camps, what held men together was the same thing that holds people together in every extreme circumstance, the recognition of each other's humanity. Beyond the Rhine and the French labor camps, there's another chapter of this story that deserves sustained attention, and that is the legal and moral aftermath. The question of how the international community responded to what it eventually learned had happened. The answer, for many years, was that it did not respond at all, because it did not know. And it did not know because the evidence had been carefully managed. The Nuremberg trials, which ran from November 1945 through October 1946, established a framework of international accountability for the crimes of the Nazi regime that was historically unprecedented. For the first time, individuals were held legally responsible for crimes committed in the name of the state, for crimes against peace, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity. The principle that following orders was not a complete defense against individual criminal liability was established in international law. The principle that the systematic murder of civilian populations was a crime against all of humanity, not merely an internal matter of the perpetrating state, became a foundation of the post-war international order. The same principles applied to the treatment of German prisoners in Allied custody would have produced uncomfortable conclusions. The Geneva Conventions, which Nuremberg implicitly affirmed as binding international law, prohibited exactly the kind of treatment that German prisoners received in American DF camps and French labor facilities. The legal reclassification of prisoners to remove their protections was precisely the kind of legal manipulation that Nuremberg prosecutors had condemned when German lawyers had used analogous techniques to justify the treatment of Soviet prisoners and occupied civilian populations. Nobody applied those principles to Allied conduct. Nobody was expected to in 1945 and 1946, and nobody did. The victors of the Second World War were not going to put themselves on trial for what happened in the Rhine Meadow Camps. That is a realistic observation about how power operates, not a complaint. But it does underscore the degree to which the legal framework established at Nuremberg was, in its initial application, a framework for judging the defeated rather than a universal standard applied impartially to all parties. The universalization of that standard, the extension of the Nuremberg principles to apply to the conduct of all states, including democratic states, including the victors, has been one of the central projects of international humanitarian law in the decades since the war. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, revised and expanded in the wake of the war's revelations about prisoner treatment on all sides, explicitly closed some of the loopholes that had permitted the death reclassification. The convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, known as the Third Geneva Convention, specified that the status of prisoner of war applied from the moment of capture and could not be removed by administrative reclassification. The legal mechanism that the American Army had used to strip German prisoners of their protections in 1945 was specifically prohibited by the framework that emerged from the war's accounting of its own abuses. This is how international humanitarian law develops, not through abstract philosophical progress, but through the specific, documented failures of the past that become the basis for rules designed to prevent their repetition. The Rhine Meadow Camps contributed, indirectly and without acknowledgement, to the legal architecture of the post-war world. The suffering of the men in those camps was part of the evidence that the 1949 conventions were designed to respond to, even if that connection was never publicly made, and even if the men who had suffered were never formally acknowledged as part of the story. The demographic work that has done most to establish what actually happened to the German prisoners of the Second World War was produced by Rüdiger Overmans, a German military historian who spent most of the 1990s compiling the most rigorous accounting of German military casualties ever attempted. His book, published in German in 1999 and translated into other languages subsequently, drew on archival sources in Germany, Russia, the United States, France, and Britain that had not previously been synthesized, and produced a framework for understanding German prisoner deaths that is based on actual records rather than political convenience or sensationalist extrapolation. Overmans' findings confirmed the broad picture that earlier researchers had sketched while filling in proportions more precisely. The total number of German prisoners who died in Allied captivity, in all theaters, under all flags, from the beginning of the war to the final repatriations in the mid-1950s, was somewhere in a range of 1 million to 1.3 million men. The Soviet Union accounted for the large majority of those deaths. France accounted for a significant secondary share. The United States accounted for a smaller, but still significant portion, concentrated in the Rhine Meadow period of 1945. Britain accounted for a tiny fraction. These numbers exist within a context that Overmans himself was careful to establish. The German military was responsible for the deaths of approximately 5 million Soviet prisoners of war, men who were deliberately starved, worked death shot, or simply abandoned in open fields in winter with no food or shelter as a matter of explicit German policy. German forces killed millions of civilians across occupied Europe, including the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of Roma, disabled people, Soviet political commissars, and others targeted for extermination. The accounting is not symmetric. The suffering caused by Germany vastly exceeds the suffering inflicted on Germany, including the suffering inflicted on German prisoners. But Overmans was also clear that this context did not make the deaths of German prisoners historically insignificant or morally irrelevant. 1 million dead is 1 million dead, whatever their uniform. The mechanisms that produced those deaths are worth understanding. The decisions made by Allied authorities, the death reclassification, the denial of Red Cross access, the inadequate food distribution in French custody, the Soviet incorporation of prisoners into the Gulag system were decisions that shaped the fate of millions of human beings, and they deserve the same clear-eyed examination that we apply to other wartime decisions. There is one more thread of this story that deserves to be pulled. The German prisoners who survived captivity and eventually returned home, whether in 1945, 1948, or 1956, came back to a Germany that was in the process of constructing a new identity from the ruins of the old one. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, was a democracy built explicitly on a rejection of everything the Third Reich had represented. It was a state founded on guilt, on the acknowledgement of what Germany had done to Europe and to the Jews, and on the commitment to never allow those things to happen again. The returning prisoners had to find a place within this new Germany, and the place was not always easy to locate. The men who came back from Soviet captivity in the early and mid-1950s returned to a country that had been rebuilding for nearly a decade. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was already underway. West Germany was transforming with astonishing speed from a bombed-out rubble field into one of the most dynamic industrial economies in the world. Cities that had been flattened were rising again. New cars were appearing on reconstructed roads. Consumer goods that had been unavailable for years were filling new shops. The returning prisoners walked into this rising prosperity from a world of Siberian coal mines and Kazakh labor camps, and the gap between where they had been and where Germany now was produced a kind of temporal vertigo that was difficult to describe and harder to process. The official Germany of the early 1950s received the returning prisoners with a combination of genuine warmth and studied avoidance. The warmth was real. These were men who had been away for a decade, who had been given up for dead, whose families had grieved and rebuilt around their absence, and now had them back. The celebrations at the train stations when the repatriation trains arrived from the Soviet Union were genuine expressions of a grief that was finally finding its resolution. Konrad Adenauer's government worked for years to secure the release of the remaining prisoners, and when the final group was repatriated in 1955 and 1956, following Adenauer's personal trip to Moscow, the political achievement was enormous. The studied avoidance was equally real and operated alongside the warmth without apparent contradiction. The returning prisoners were welcomed home as individuals, as sons and husbands and fathers. They were not welcomed home as a collective whose experience demanded public accounting. The question of what they had been through, the specifics of Soviet captivity, the conditions of the camps, the reasons why so many of their comrades had not come back, was not a subject for public discussion in a Germany that was still in the early stages of working through the vastly more significant question of what Germany had done to others. The prisoners came home. Their stories stayed with them in the private spaces of family and the silence that families maintain around the things that are too hard to say out loud. The organization that tried to give those men a collective voice was the Verband der Heimkehrer, the Association of Returnees, which was founded in 1950 to represent the interests of returning prisoners and to advocate for those still held. The association worked on practical matters: pensions, recognition of captivity years for social insurance purposes, assistance of men who had returned broken in body or mind and needed help rebuilding functional lives. It also tried to press for public acknowledgement of what its members had experienced. That part of its mission was less successful. The political climate of the 1950s Federal Republic was not hospitable to German narratives of suffering. The association's efforts to have conditions of Soviet captivity formally acknowledged as a violation of international law were, for decades, either ignored or actively resisted by a political establishment that feared the uses to which such acknowledgments might be put. The fear was not irrational. Right-wing political actors in post-war Germany were in fact attempting to use the narrative of German suffering, the bombing of Dresden, the prisoner camps, the expulsion of ethnic Germans in the East, to argue for a moral equivalence between German crimes and Allied responses that was historically dishonest and morally bankrupt. The legitimate suffering of returning prisoners was being instrumentalized by people whose actual goal was not justice for the prisoners, but the rehabilitation of the Nazi project that had caused everything. The political establishment's resistance to German suffering narratives was partly a response to this instrumentalization, a refusal to provide material for revisionist projects. But the refusal came at a cost, because the genuine histories got suppressed along with the dishonest ones, and the men who had actually suffered were denied the public acknowledgement that, independent of any political use, was simply owed to them as human beings who had been through something real and terrible. This tension between the necessity of clear-eyed acknowledgement of German guilt and the equal necessity of honestly accounting for German suffering has never been fully resolved. It continues to shape German historical memory and German public discourse in ways that are sometimes productive and sometimes paralyzing. The most honest German historians of the past generation have tried to hold both things simultaneously, to write about the bombing of Hamburg and the deaths in the Rhine Meadow Camps without for a moment losing sight of the context that German aggression created. That work is ongoing. It is some of the most important historical writing being produced anywhere because the specific challenge it addresses, how to maintain moral clarity about great crimes while also telling the full truth about everything that followed from them, is a challenge that every society that has ever committed or suffered great violence eventually has to face. I want to bring this back to where I started, to the moment the guns went quiet, to the particular quality of that silence after years of noise, because the story of the German prisoners is, at its deepest level, a story about what happens in that silence, about who gets to define the terms of peace, about the gap between the principles that wars are fought to defend and the practices through which those wars are concluded. The Allied powers in 1945 were, in a meaningful sense, the right side of history. They were fighting a regime that had put genocide at the center of its political project. The values they claimed to be defending, human dignity, the rule of law, the rights of the individual against the power of the totalitarian state, were genuine values. Values we're fighting for, values that the post-war order was genuinely attempting to institutionalize in the form of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which expanded and strengthened protections established in 1929. And yet, in the specific, concrete, documented reality of what happened to the German prisoners in the Rhine Meadow Camps and the French labor details and the Siberian coal mines, those values were compromised. Legal frameworks were bent to permit treatment that the frameworks existed to prevent. Oversight mechanisms were blocked. Evidence was suppressed. Men died who should have lived, in conditions that the governments responsible for them knew were inadequate and chose not to fix, for reasons that had more to do with administrative convenience and institutional embarrassment than with genuine operational necessity. The lesson is not that the Allies were as bad as Germany. They were not, and any attempt to construct that equivalence is historically dishonest and morally bankrupt. The lesson is that the gap between stated values and actual practice is a universal human vulnerability that appears in the conduct of the righteous as well as the wicked, and that closing that gap requires constant institutional vigilance and the willingness to hold even one's own side accountable when the evidence demands it. For 40 years, the evidence was suppressed. The records are open now. The truth is available to anyone who wants to find it, in the archives of multiple countries, in the demographic work of careful historians, in the memoirs and testimonies of men who came home from captivity and eventually found the language to describe what they had lived through. The silence has been broken. What remains is the obligation that attaches to knowing, the obligation to look at what actually happened, to hold its complexity without flinching, to neither inflate it into an equivalence it does not deserve nor dismiss it into an irrelevance it has not earned. The men in the Rhine Meadow fields are part of the history of the Second World War. The men who died in the French labor camps are part of that history. The million or more who died in Soviet captivity are part of that history. They were soldiers of a criminal regime. They were also human beings. History insists on both things simultaneously. Before you leave, I want to ask one thing of you. If this story, this particular chapter of a war that still shapes the world we live in, gave you something to think about, then help this work continue. Subscribe if you have not already. Share this video with someone who takes history seriously. Leave a comment below about which part of this history was new to you, because your engagement with this work is what makes it possible to keep doing it. The stories that get buried are usually the ones that matter most, the ones that challenge our categories, that complicate our certainties, that insist on being more than simple morality plays. This one was buried for 40 years. Now it is out. Now it is yours. The war ended on May 8, 1945. For some men, it lasted another decade. For all of us, the reckoning with what those years actually produced, the full accounting, not the comfortable edited version, is work that is never quite finished. I will see you in the next one.